dawn came thin and cold, the kind that made engines sound lonely, and the Hells Angels Clubhouse sat quiet at the edge of the industrial strip, a squat concrete box with scars in its walls and history in its bones. When a skinny runaway kid with cracked lips and shaking hands slid a small cloth bundle under the steel door and ran, shoes slapping the pavement like he was already being chased, and inside that bundle was an old medal, scratched and heavy, the kind only earned in blood and miles. The kind no one was supposed to lose, and when Axel Graves Moreno arrived minutes later on his blacked-out road glide, he saw the cloth first, felt the wrongness in his gut before he even bent down, and when he opened it and saw the medal, his chest tightened like a fist closing, because it belonged to Rook, his road brother, dead 3 years now, buried with a flag and a promise that his family would never be alone. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And Graves stood there in the gray light, remembering a hospital hallway that smelled like bleach, remembering Rook's voice breaking as he said, "Take care, my girl. Take care of my kid." And Graves had nodded, then like a man who meant it, like a man who believed time wouldn't steal chances. And now this medal was back, returned by a ghost or a desperate hand. And that meant something had gone wrong in a way that didn't forgive delay. He pushed the door open, and the clubhouse smelled like oil and old coffee, the walls lined with photos of rides and funerals. And he called out low, "Someone's been here," and the word someone echoed heavier than it should, because the club had enemies and debts and rules, and none of them left gifts at dawn unless they were begging or warning. Graves' mind ran cold and fast, cataloging threats. The cartel boys pushing north, the sheriff who smiled too much, the rival crew sniffing around their routes. And he picked up the medal again, feeling the grooves worn smooth by Rook's thumb, thinking about a kid old enough now to run, to be lost, to be hunted, and his jaw set, the scar along it pulling tight, because this wasn't about territory or money. This was about a promise, and promises were the only thing that made the nights quiet enough to sleep. He stepped outside and scanned the empty road, saw nothing but heat shimmer and a stray dog watching him with the same tired eyes he'd seen in too many mirrors. And as he turned back in, he noticed a smear of blood on the concrete, faint but real, leading away toward the tracks, and the anger rose then, slow and controlled, the kind that didn't shout but moved mountains. He locked the door and went to the back room where the table still held last night's cards, and he sat, breathing once, twice, because a leader didn't panic, a leader acted, and the act started with knowing, with finding the kid who'd been brave or stupid enough to bring this back. And as the sun finally cleared the warehouses, Graves spoke to the empty room like Rook could hear him. "I got you." And the words tasted like iron. And somewhere down the line a boy was running with bad men behind him and a secret heavy in his pocket. And the city was waking up unaware that a line had been crossed, that old debts had been called in by a shaking hand at dawn, and that when Graves stood up and put the medal back in his cut, close to his heart, the day had already chosen violence or mercy, depending on who got there first. And with that thought sliding through his head like a memory he didn't question, he grabbed his helmet and stepped back outside, the engine barking to life, the sound carrying across empty streets. Because somewhere a kid needed the kind of protection only a broken man with a loyal club could give, and Graves rode toward the tracks, toward the blood smear and the truth waiting at the end of it, knowing that whatever he found would cost him something, and accepting that cost the way he always had, without looking back. By the time the sun burned off the last of the fog, the clubhouse was alive, engines rumbling outside like caged animals, boots on concrete, low voices carrying the weight of years, and Graves stood at the head of the long table with a medal resting in front of him. Silent proof that this wasn't just another problem to scare away, and one by one the brothers filtered in, each reading his face and understanding without words that something old and personal had come back around. Bear took his usual spot near the door, broad shoulders filling the space. The club's enforcer who spoke little and hit hard when talk failed, his eyes already scanning exits out of habit. Doc slid into a chair with a coffee and a medical kit at his feet, gray beard tucked in his vest. The man who had stitched them back together more times than anyone could count, whose calm voice had steadied dying men. Latch leaned against the wall with a tablet in hand, sharp-eyed and always thinking 3 moves ahead. The strategist who knew routes, money, and enemies like a map burned in his brain. Cruz posted by the window. The lookout, younger but alert, watching the street like trouble might walk in wearing a badge or a smile. And finally, Mason dropped into a chair across from Graves. Vice President, scarred knuckles, and a mind that weighed loyalty against survival every time. And when the door shut and the room settled, Graves picked up the medal and slid it across the table so everyone could see it. And the reaction was instant, a low mutter, a chair scraping back, Doc's hand pausing mid-sip, because everyone knew whose it was. Everyone remembered the funeral ride, the rain, the promise. Graves spoke steady. This showed up under our door at dawn. And Mason leaned forward, eyes hard. That don't happen for no reason. Bear cracked his neck and said, means someone's in trouble or someone's stupid. And Latch frowned, already tapping notes, or both. Graves nodded. There was blood by the tracks, light but fresh. A kid ran, a runaway by the look of the prints. And the word kid shifted the room, because lines existed even for men who lived outside most rules. Doc cleared his throat. Rook's kid would be about that age now. And the silence that followed was heavy because no one liked saying it out loud. But it fit too clean. Mason exhaled slow. You think someone got to the family. Graves didn't answer right away. He remembered the last check he'd sent, the last call that went unanswered, the way life distracted even the best intentions. And finally he said, I think the kid found the only thing he thought would make us listen. And Bear's jaw tightened. Then someone scared him bad. Cruz spoke from the window. Sheriff's cruiser just passed slow, and Latch looked up. That sheriff's been sniffing our dock since the cartel moved in, and there it was, the thread tying it together. The cartel boss named Calderon who wore clean suits and used dirty cops who wanted their routes and didn't like being told no. Mason said what they were all thinking. If Calderon's involved, this ain't small. Graves met his eyes. Nothing about this is small. And he stood, resting his hands on the table, the old scar on his forearm catching the light. We find the kid first. We don't move loud. We don't give Calderon an excuse to bring heat down on the family or the block. Bear snorted. Quiet ain't my thing. Graves gave him a look that said it didn't have to be. That's why you wait until I say. Doc nodded. If the kid's bleeding, time matters. Latch added. I can pull cameras near the tracks, see which way he ran, and I know a shelter 2 miles east that Calderon's men lean on for info. Mason leaned back, weighing it. If we move there, we risk tipping our hand. Graves said, we're already tipped. The metal under our door was a flare. Cruz turned, another cruiser, and the tension rose. Not panic, just focus. The kind born of years surviving worse. Graves assigned roles like he always did, calm and precise. Latch, you track the kid. No noise. Use your back channels. Doc, get ready. We may need you in the field. Bear, you ride with me, but you don't swing unless I tell you. Mason, you hold the room. If Calderon pokes, you talk. Mason raised a brow. And if talk fails, Graves didn't smile. Then we remind him who keeps the roads. The room breathed again. A shared understanding settling in, because this was what they did, protect their own, even when the world said they were the bad men. And as they broke, engines fired up outside, the sound echoing down the block like a warning. Graves pulled Mason aside, voice low. "If this goes sideways, I need you to keep the club together." Mason studied him. "You thinking you won't come back?" Graves shrugged. "I'm thinking about the kid." Mason clapped his shoulder. "That's why they follow you." Outside, Graves swung a leg over his bike, Bear beside him like a moving wall. And as they rolled out, Latch's message buzzed in. A still from a grainy camera. A boy limping east. A man in a jacket watching from a car with tinted windows. And a plate that traced back to one of Calderon's shell companies. Graves felt the path narrow, choices closing like doors. And he rode harder, the city blurring, knowing the brotherhood was moving as one now, knowing the next step will be felt by men who didn't forgive interference. And as the highway opened and the wind cut through him, he thought about Rook again, about the promise made in a hallway that smelled like bleach. And he knew that whatever waited at the end of this ride, the club was committed, the line drawn, and there would be no clean way out once they crossed it. Night came down heavy and fast, the kind that pressed close to the skin, and Graves felt it as he and Bear rolled dark with their lights cut, coasting the last stretch toward the abandoned cannery where Latch's trail had led them, a place Calderon's men used because everyone pretended not to see it. And inside Graves' head the pieces kept shifting, memories flashing between the road ahead and a hospital bed years ago, because this felt too familiar, like fate circling back to collect interest. And when they parked and moved on foot, the air smelled of rust and brine, footsteps echoing too loud in his ears, Bear's presence a steady weight at his shoulder. And through a broken window, Graves saw the boy, Rook's kid for sure now, older but with the same eyes, sitting on a crate with his hands tied, a cut above his brow, fear held in by stubborn pride, and across from him stood Calderon's lieutenant, a thin man with polite manners and dead eyes, talking like he was doing the kid a favor, offering food, safety, lies, and Graves' jaw locked because the offer was always the same: give us the routes. Give us the names, give us the leverage, and before he could move, his phone buzzed once. Mason's code for trouble, followed by a message that tightened his chest. Doc had been picked up, pulled over by that smiling sheriff on a made-up warrant, and that was the move, Calderon squeezing from both sides, forcing a choice, and Bear growled low. Say the word, but Graves held up a hand, because charging now would get the kid hurt and Doc stuck. And in that pause, Calderon himself stepped into view like he'd been waiting for the camera to pan. Clean suit even here, shoes untouched by grime, smiling like a man who'd already won. "Graves," he called softly, "I knew you'd come." And Graves stepped out into the open, hands loose at his sides, voice calm. "Let the kid go," Calderon chuckled. "You always did go straight to the heart." And he gestured. "This boy brought me something valuable, a medal, a story, a way in." And the kid looked up then, eyes meeting Graves, shame and hope tangled. And Graves felt it like a blade because the kid had tried to do the right thing and the world had punished him for it. Calderon continued, "Your club blocks my roads, my business, but you are men of honor. I respect that. So here's my offer." And he nodded to a man who rolled a monitor out showing Doc in the back of a cruiser. Calm but bleeding from a split lip, you walk away. From the East Docks tonight, quietly, and everyone lives. Bear shifted, muscles coiling, and Graves thought about the docks feeding families, about giving ground meaning giving more later, about promises stacking up until they crushed you. And he met Calderon's eyes, seeing the intelligence there, the patience, the certainty that fear would do the work. And Graves said, "You don't get to bargain with my people." Calderon sighed, disappointed, and snapped his fingers, and the lieutenant pressed a gun to the kid's head, not touching skin but close enough, and time stretched thin, And in that space, Cruz's voice crackled in Graves' ear, barely audible. "Boss, sheriff's convoy just turned off the highway." Doc's with them, and Graves understood then that Calderon planned to erase witnesses either way, that this was never about a deal. It was about breaking the club's spine in one clean motion, and a memory hit him. Rook laughing on a long night ride, saying if it ever comes down to it, you choose the kid because kids don't get a vote in the world they're born into. And Graves made his decision, quick and final. And he nodded once to Bear, who moved like thunder, slamming into the lieutenant just as Graves rushed Calderon. The room exploding in his shouts and scrambling feet, the gun clattering away, the kid yelling, and Graves took a hard blow to the ribs, but kept moving, drove Calderon back against the table, feeling the man's surprise as control slipped, and outside. Sirens wailed, closer now. Everything converging, Bear went down under two men and got back up again like pain was suggestion. Cruz's voice shouting updates, latch hacking lights, plunging the cannery into darkness broken by muzzle flashes that stayed wide and wild because no one wanted to hit the kid, and Graves used that hesitation, getting between Calderon and the boy, taking a hitman for him, feeling heat bloom and then fade as adrenaline took over, and Calderon smiled even then, whispering, "You lose tonight," and Graves answered, "Maybe," and headbutted him hard enough to send him stumbling. And in that chaos, the kid slipped free, Doc's voice suddenly in Graves' ear, hoarse but alive. "Graves, listen, Mason cut a deal, temporary, he's buying us time," and that was the betrayal, small and sharp, because Mason had talked without the table, had been a rule to save a life. And Graves felt the sting of it, even as he understood, because loyalty wasn't clean, it was choices. Made under pressure that left scars, and with the sirens seconds away, Graves grabbed the kid, shouted for Bear, and they vanished through a side door into the night, leaving Calderon standing in the wreckage, eyes cold and promising hell. And as they ran, Graves knew there was no going back now, no half measures left because blood had been drawn, lines crossed, and the collision had only just begun. The city held its breath the night everything settled, rain slicking the streets until reflections doubled the world, and Graves rode with the kid tucked behind him, Bear guarding their rear, Doc patched and riding slow but steady, and Mason waiting at the clubhouse with the lights low and the table cleared, because there were moments when a place became a decision instead of shelter, and this was one of them. The boy's arms tight around Graves' waist like he might slip off the earth if he let go, whispering apologies into the wind that cut through Graves deeper than any blade. And when they rolled in and shut the doors, the noise died and the truth filled the room. Mason standing there with a look that held both defiance and regret, saying, "I bought time." And Graves nodded once because time was what they needed now, not forgiveness. Doc set the kid down and cleaned the cut gentle, telling him stories about stitches and scars, keeping his hands steady so the boy's shaking would slow. And Graves listened as the kid finally spoke, voice breaking as he told them about Calderon's men coming to his mother's place, about threats dressed as favors, about how he'd taken the medal because it was the only thing that felt strong enough to reach men who didn't scare easy. And Graves felt the weight of it settle right where his heart used to be soft, and he told the kid the truth, that his father had been brave and stubborn and loved him more than Rhodes, and that bringing the medal back had been the right thing, even if it hurt. And the boy cried then, quiet and exhausted, and fell asleep against Doc's shoulder. And that's when Latch laid out the last move, voice calm like numbers couldn't bleed. "Calderon thinks he won tonight. He thinks the sheriff's in his pocket, and Mason's nervous. He'll make his play at the docks at first light." Mason looked up. "You're sure?" Latch nodded. I pulled his calls. He's greedy when he smells weakness. Graves leaned back, ribs aching, thinking about promises and costs, and said, "Then we finish it." Bear smiled without humor. "Been waiting," but Graves raised a hand. Not loud, not messy, and not on the kid's back. And they planned with the kind of precision born of fear and care. Routes timed to patrol shifts, cameras looped, trucks stalled just long enough, evidence seated where it would matter. Because justice didn't always wear a badge, but it could use paperwork when it had to. And as dawn crept in pale and unforgiving, the club moved, engines muffled, shadows sliding where light didn't reach. And at the docks, Calderon arrived like a king expecting applause, only to find doors locked by orders he couldn't override and a sheriff already sweating under the weight of calls he couldn't dodge. And when Graves stepped out from between containers, alone and unarmed, Calderon laughed. "You came to beg." And Graves shook his head. "I came to end it." And the confrontation was quieter than anyone expected. Words landing heavier than fists. Graves laying out names and dates and recordings Latch had pulled, the kind that made allies turn away fast. And Calderon's smile thinned, eyes darting, because power was a thing that fled when witnesses arrived. And sirens came then, real ones this time, drawn by evidence too solid to ignore. And Calderon reached for a gun that never cleared leather, because Bear was there, fast and final, pinning him without breaking him, because Graves wanted him alive to answer for what he'd done. And the sheriff arrived with a face like chalk, understanding too late that he'd bet on the wrong side. And as cuffs clicked and cameras flashed, Graves felt no triumph, only a tired settling, because justice delivered still left dense, still asked for payment. And that payment came an hour later when Mason pulled him aside, voice low. "I'm stepping down." Graves stared at him. "You don't have to." Mason shook his head. "I broke the table, even for the right reason. Someone else needs to hold that line." And Graves understood, because consequences were the spine of any code, and he clasped Mason's forearm. "You save a life," Mason answered. "So did you." And the club felt the change ripple through it. Quiet acceptance, loyalty adjusting without breaking. And when the sun was fully up and the docks were loud with honest work again, Graves took the kid to the edge of town where Rook was buried, handed him the medal, and said, "This belongs to you." And the boy hesitated, then pressed it back into Graves' palm. "Keep it safe." And Graves swallowed, nodded, because sometimes protection meant carrying weight so someone else didn't have to. And they arranged a place for the kid with people who would guard him without asking for anything back, because family could be built as much as it was born. And that night the clubhouse was quieter, the table scarred but standing, engines cooling. And Graves sat alone for a moment, listening to the building. Breathe, feeling the ache of choices made and the peace of promises kept. Knowing Calderon would rot in a cell, but men like him always left shadows. Knowing roads never ended clean. And when he finally stood and walked outside, the rain had washed the streets clear, the lights stretched long and honest, and Graves rode into them, not chasing anything, just carrying the weight forward, ready if it came back around, because that was the cost of loyalty. And he paid it without complaint.